Welcome to Northern Mystery Archives. Here we don't soften the truth, and we don't skip the details. We investigate the forgotten files from the far north of Canada, the disappearances that were quietly shelved, the settlements that faded from every map, the transmissions that were never meant to be heard again. In this channel, nothing is hidden. Every fragment, every silence, every erased trail is examined with the seriousness these cases deserved, but never received. If you value cold, atmospheric minimalist investigations into the unexplained wilderness of the North, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and step with us into the files they hoped no one would ever revisit. Below, we will be speaking about the case titled Rowan Pierce, Winter 1990 Cursed Northern Highway Disappearance. It all began when a maintenance worker found a set of tire tracks leading off Highway 43 into the boreal expanse. Tracks that appeared suddenly in fresh snow with no preceding marks, as though the vehicle had materialized from nowhere before plunging into the wilderness. The Provincial Archive holds a manila folder marked Case Reference NW 90217. Inside, 17 pages of incident reports, witness statements, and search coordinates tell a story that investigators never managed to explain. The file was assembled over 6 weeks in the winter of 1990, then sealed without resolution and transferred to cold storage. It concerns the disappearance of Rowan Pierce, a 29-year-old geological surveyor who vanished along a remote stretch of Northern Highway during a routine drive between field sites. The incident occurred in the third week of February, during a period when temperatures regularly dropped to -38 Celsius. Pierce had been working for Northern Resources Geological Survey, conducting soil and mineral assessments in territories west of Lesser Slave Lake. His assignment required him to travel between 3 survey markers spread across 200 kilometers of wilderness, a journey that involved long stretches of isolated highway where service stations could be separated by hours of driving. Pierce was described by colleagues as methodical and experienced. He'd completed 19 months with the survey team and had driven these routes dozens of times. He kept detailed logs of mileage, weather conditions, and equipment status. He carried emergency supplies as a matter of routine, not paranoia. Winter driving in that region demanded preparation, and Pierce understood this. The fact that someone with his experience and preparation simply disappeared made the case particularly unsettling to those who knew the territory. On the morning of February 17th, Pierce departed Survey Station 12, a temporary field office located 43 kilometers south of the settlement, known as Calling Lake. His destination was Survey Station 9, positioned near the eastern boundary of what was then designated as Restricted Forestry Zone 7. The distance between stations was 168 kilometers. Under normal winter conditions, the drive would take approximately 3 hours. Pierce informed the station supervisor he would check in via radio once he arrived. That transmission never came. The vehicle Pierce was driving was a 1987 Ford Bronco, painted Forest Service green with yellow Survey Corps markings on both doors. The truck had been outfitted with reinforced suspension, all-terrain tires, and a high-clearance exhaust system. It carried survey equipment, core samples from the previous day's work, emergency rations, winter survival gear, and 2 full jerry cans of fuel. The vehicle was in documented working condition, having passed a mechanical inspection 5 days before the incident. Highway 43. Between Calling Lake and the forestry zone was a 2-lane paved road maintained irregularly during winter months. Sections of the highway passed through dense black spruce forest, where visibility dropped to less than 50 meters in snow conditions. There were no gas stations, rest stops, or settlements along that particular stretch. Radio communication was unreliable due to the terrain, though drivers could occasionally reach relay towers if atmospheric conditions were favorable. Pierce left Survey Station 12 at 8:43 in the morning. The logbook shows he signed out personally, noting clear skies and a recorded temperature of -31°C. He mentioned to a co-worker that he'd planned to make one brief stop at kilometer marker 79 to photograph an exposed rock face for the geological database. That stop would have added approximately 15 minutes to his journey. No one saw him again. When Pierce failed to arrive at Survey Station 9 by early afternoon, the supervisor there assumed weather or mechanical trouble had caused a delay. By 1600 hours, concern began to mount. Radio calls went unanswered. By 1800 hours, with darkness settling across the region, the decision was made to contact the Provincial Highway Patrol. A missing person protocol was initiated. 2 patrol vehicles were dispatched to retrace the route Pierce should have taken. The search vehicles departed from opposite ends of the highway, planning to meet somewhere in the middle. Both crews carried high-powered searchlights and thermal detection equipment. Highway 43 cuts through a section of boreal forest that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. The region is characterized by dense stands of black spruce, tamarack, and jack pine, interspersed with frozen muskeg and shallow depressions that fill with water during spring thaw. In winter, the landscape becomes a monochrome expanse of white and grey, where individual landmarks blur together and distances become difficult to judge. The highway itself was constructed in the early 1960s as part of a resource access initiative. Its original purpose was to connect forestry operations and mining exploration sites to southern supply routes. By the late 80s, much of that industrial activity had ceased, leaving the road to serve primarily as a transit corridor for government survey teams and the occasional long-haul trucker seeking an alternate route. During winter months, the highway saw minimal traffic. Some days, fewer than a dozen vehicles would traverse the entire length between Calling Lake and the forestry zone boundary. This isolation meant that mechanical breakdowns or accidents could go unnoticed for extended periods. There were documented cases of stranded motorists who'd waited more than 24 hours before another vehicle passed by. The forest on either side of the highway was classified as Crown land, meaning it was publicly owned but largely unmanaged. Logging roads branched off at irregular intervals, most of them unmaintained and impassable during winter. Some of these roads led to abandoned work camps or decommissioned timber harvest sites. Others simply terminated in clearings that had been surveyed decades earlier and then forgotten. The terrain was deceptively treacherous. What appeared to be solid ground could conceal pockets of frozen muskeg capable of swallowing a vehicle. Snow depths varied dramatically depending on wind patterns and tree cover. In open areas, snowdrifts could reach 2 meters in height, while beneath dense canopy, the ground might hold only a thin crust of ice over unstable peat. Wildlife in the region included moose, black bear in hibernation, timber wolves, and lynx. Ravens were common, their calls echoing through the forest during daylight hours. At night, the silence was absolute, except for the occasional crack of freezing wood or the distant howl of wind across frozen lake surfaces. Radio communication in this area was notoriously problematic. The province had installed several relay towers along the highway corridor, but coverage remained spotty. Transmission success depended on atmospheric conditions, solar activity, and the precise location of the broadcaster. Drivers were advised to carry CB radios as backup, though even these were unreliable over distances exceeding 20 kilometers. Survey Station 12, Pierce's point of departure, consisted of 3 prefabricated buildings arranged in a cluster 30 meters from the highway. The facility housed temporary sleeping quarters, a small laboratory for processing geological samples, and a storage shed for equipment. During winter operations, Anywhere from 4 to 8 personnel might be stationed there for weeks at a time. The station had its own generator, water supply from a drilled well, and a satellite phone for emergency use only. Survey Station 9, Pierce's intended destination, was a smaller installation consisting of a single building and an equipment cache. It sat on a low ridge overlooking what was known as Blackwater Creek, though in winter the creek was indistinguishable from the surrounding frozen landscape. The station was normally occupied by 2 geologists during active survey periods. At the time of Pierce's disappearance, both were present and waiting for his arrival with equipment he was transporting. The stretch of highway between these 2 points included several features that would later become relevant to the investigation. At kilometer marker 47, the road crossed a steel frame bridge spanning a ravine carved by centuries of spring runoff. At kilometer marker 62, there was a gravel turnout where trucks sometimes parked overnight. At kilometer marker 79, the location where Pierce had intended to stop for photographs, a rock escarpment rose directly adjacent to the southbound lane, its stratified layers of sedimentary stone, visible even through winter ice. Beyond kilometer marker 83, the highway entered what locals referred to as the Dead Mile, a section where radio transmission became nearly impossible due to some quirk of topography that researchers had never adequately explained. Drivers passing through this section would experience several minutes of complete communication silence before signals resumed on the far side. The forest itself held a reputation among those who worked in the region. There were stories passed among survey crews and forestry workers, accounts of equipment that malfunctioned inexplicably, of compass needles that spun without settling, of distances that seemed longer when traveling in one direction than when returning. These stories were usually dismissed as the product of isolation and harsh conditions, the kind of folklore that emerges anywhere people work in remote and unforgiving environments. But there was also a documented history. Provincial records showed 3 previous disappearances along this same highway corridor over the preceding 40 years. In 1953, a forestry inspector's truck had been found abandoned at kilometer marker 91, engine still running, driver's door open, no sign of the inspector himself. In 1968, a family of 4 traveling south had vanished between Calling Lake and the forestry boundary, their vehicle never located despite extensive searches. In 1977, a geological team reported seeing lights moving through the forest at night, lights that didn't correspond to any known human activity in the area. These incidents were noted in regional archives, but never compiled into any comprehensive analysis. Each was investigated separately, filed individually, and eventually relegated to unsolved status. The highway patrol crews searching for Rowan Pierce met at approximately 2100 hours on the evening of February 17th. Having covered the entire length of highway between survey stations 12 and 9 without finding any trace of the missing surveyor or his vehicle, both crews reported the same finding: nothing. No disabled truck, no tracks leaving the roadway, no indication that Pierce had ever traveled that route. This absence of evidence was itself evidence of something irregular. A vehicle traveling that highway would leave traces: tire marks in snow-covered sections, disturbances in roadside snow where a driver might have pulled over, heat signatures detectable by thermal equipment if the vehicle had stopped recently. The patrol crews found none of these indicators. It was as though Pierce and his Bronco had simply failed to exist anywhere along that 168-kilometer stretch of road. The decision was made to expand the search at first light. Additional patrol units were summoned from detachments to the east and west. The provincial search and rescue coordinator was notified. Survey Corps personnel from both stations volunteered to assist. By dawn on February 18th, 14 people and 6 vehicles were assembled at Survey Station 12, preparing for a systematic grid search of the entire highway corridor. The search teams departed in pairs, each vehicle assigned a specific segment of highway to examine in detail. They were instructed to stop every 500 meters, scan the forest on both sides using binoculars, look for any anomaly that might indicate where a vehicle had left the road. The temperature that morning was -33°C. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, a light dusting of perhaps 2 centimeters, enough to obscure older tracks, but not enough to completely hide significant disturbances. At 10:27 hours, the crew searching the section between kilometer markers 78 and 82 made a discovery. A maintenance worker named Gerald Moss noticed something unusual in the snowpack approximately 30 meters north of the highway, just beyond a line of black spruce trees. The anomaly consisted of what appeared to be tire tracks, 2 parallel depressions in the snow leading away from the road into the forest. Moss reported the finding via radio. The search coordinator instructed his team to approach the tracks on foot without disturbing them further. Moss and his partner, a highway technician named Thomas Birch, carefully made their way through the snow to examine the tracks more closely. What they found contradicted their expectations in several fundamental ways. The tracks were fresh, pressed into snow that had fallen within the past 12 hours. They showed the distinctive tread pattern of all-terrain tires, consistent with those fitted to Survey Corps vehicles. The tracks ran straight from the roadway into the forest, as though the vehicle had been driven deliberately in that direction. But there were no corresponding tracks leading up to that point. The tire marks simply began 30 meters from the highway, with no indication of how the vehicle had arrived at that location. Moss walked back toward the road, following the trajectory of the tracks in reverse. He examined the snow between the forest and the highway shoulder, looking for any continuation of the pattern. There was none. The snow in that intervening space was undisturbed, showing only the random surface texture created by wind and the previous night's snowfall. It was as though the vehicle had appeared in the forest without first crossing the open ground between the trees and the road. The search coordinator arrived at the site within 30 minutes. He verified Moss's observations and ordered the team to follow the tracks into the forest. 6 searchers proceeded on foot, moving slowly to avoid obscuring the trail. The tracks continued in a nearly straight line, passing between trees, crossing a small frozen stream, ascending a gentle slope. The spacing and depth of the impressions suggested the vehicle had been moving slowly but steadily, under power, not being pushed or towed. Approximately 400 meters from the highway, the tracks terminated. They ended abruptly in a small clearing surrounded by dense spruce. There was no vehicle, no signs of a collision or mechanical failure, no indication of where the Bronco might have gone after reaching that point. The tracks simply stopped, the final impression showing a normal tire pattern with no evidence of skidding, sinking, or unusual pressure distribution. The clearing itself measured roughly 20 meters across. The snow within it was undisturbed except for the tracks themselves. There were no footprints, no drag marks, no debris. The surrounding trees showed no signs of impact or disturbance. It was as though the vehicle had driven to this spot and then ceased to exist. Search teams spent the remainder of that day examining the area in expanding circles from the clearing. They looked for any secondary set of tracks, any indication of where Pierce might have gone on foot if he'd abandoned the vehicle. They used metal detectors to search for buried objects, though the frozen ground would have made burial extremely difficult. They climbed trees to gain elevated vantage points, searching for any visual clue they might have missed from ground level. They found nothing. By nightfall on February 18th, the investigation had expanded to include specialized personnel. A forensic team from the provincial capital arrived with equipment for processing potential crime scenes. Tracking dogs were brought in, though the handlers cautioned that frozen ground and multiple overlapping scents from searchers would limit their effectiveness. Additional survey crews were diverted from other assignments to assist with the expanding search grid. The dogs were led to the clearing on the morning of February 19th. They showed interest in the tire tracks, but were unable to establish any trail leading away from the site. One handler noted that his dog behaved unusually in the clearing, whining and backing away from the center area where the tracks terminated. The dog had to be coaxed back to the site multiple times and continued to show reluctance to enter the clearing itself. Forensic technicians documented the tire tracks in detail, taking measurements and photographs from multiple angles. They collected snow samples from within the tracks to search for trace evidence. Fuel residue, oil, hydraulic fluid, anything that might have leaked from a vehicle. Initial analysis found no such contamination. The snow within the tracks was chemically identical to the snow surrounding them. An aerial search was conducted on February 20th using a small aircraft equipped with forward-looking infrared technology. The plane flew a grid pattern covering 40 square kilometers surrounding the discovery site. The FLIR system could detect heat signatures from large objects even beneath tree canopy. The search identified several heat sources that proved to be wildlife, primarily moose, but found no indication of a vehicle or human presence. On February 21st, a tracker with extensive wilderness experience was brought in to examine the site independently. His name was Joseph Crowchild, a man who'd spent 30 years working as a guide and search specialist in northern Alberta. Crowchild spent 4 hours at the clearing, examining the tracks, the surrounding terrain, and the forest beyond. His report to investigators contained a single observational note. The tracks tell 2 stories. One says a vehicle drove here. The investigation into Rowan Pierce's disappearance officially became a missing person case under suspicious circumstances on February 22nd. Lead investigator was Detective Constable Raymond Thorne from the Provincial Serious Crimes Unit. Thorne had worked dozens of cases involving disappearances in remote areas, though he would later state in interviews that nothing in his experience prepared him for the inconsistencies present in Pierce's case. Thorne's first action was to establish a timeline using radio logs, station records, and witness statements. The timeline confirmed that Pierce had signed out of Survey Station 12 at 8:43 hours on February 17th. The station supervisor remembered Pierce checking fuel levels and confirming his route. A co-worker had helped Pierce load equipment into the Bronco and recalled that Pierce seemed in normal spirits, discussing plans for the evening once he reached Station 9. The Bronco's odometer reading was recorded in the station log as 37,042 kilometers when Pierce departed. This detail would become significant later when investigators attempted to calculate how far the vehicle might have traveled. If the Bronco was the source of the tracks found in the forest and those tracks were 400 meters from the highway, then the total distance traveled from Station 12 would have been approximately 49 kilometers, assuming Pierce had followed the most direct route, but this calculation presented immediate problems. The tire tracks were found near kilometer marker 79, which was 51 kilometers from Station 12 by highway distance. The 2-kilometer discrepancy seemed minor until Thorne considered that Pierce had been driving a government vehicle with meticulously maintained records. If Pierce had followed the highway, the odometer and the marker position should have aligned within a few hundred meters. The gap suggested either Pierce had deviated from the route or the vehicle had been moved by some means that didn't register as normal driving. Interviews with Survey Corps personnel revealed that Pierce was known for being punctual and procedure-oriented. He always radioed when departing, maintained speed limits even on empty roads, and documented any deviations from planned routes. The idea that he might have spontaneously left the highway to explore a logging road seemed inconsistent with his established patterns. Moreover, there were no logging roads or marked turnoffs anywhere near kilometer marker 79. The forest there was unbroken wilderness with no vehicle access points. Thorne arranged for a detailed examination of the area where the tracks had been found. A surveyor was brought in to map the precise location and orientation of the tracks relative to the highway. The surveyor's report noted that the tracks ran perpendicular to the road at an angle of 87 degrees, almost perfectly straight into the forest. This suggested deliberate steering, rather than a vehicle sliding off the road due to loss of control. The forensic analysis of the tracks themselves produced confusing results. The tread pattern matched the specifications of tires fitted to Survey Corps Broncos, including the specific wear patterns consistent with a vehicle that had driven several thousand kilometers on both paved and gravel surfaces. Chemical analysis of rubber particles found in the compressed snow confirmed they were consistent with the tire manufacturer used by the Survey Corps. But there was something else. The depth and compression pattern of the tracks indicated a vehicle with significant weight, consistent with a Bronco loaded with equipment. Yet the track showed no corresponding disturbance to the snow surface ahead of the initial impression. It was as though the vehicle had set down into the snow, already in motion, rather than accelerating from a stopped position. This observation prompted Thorne to request a reconstruction analysis. A forensic specialist in vehicle dynamics examined photographs and measurements of the tracks. His report stated that the initial tire impressions at the point nearest the highway showed characteristics consistent with a vehicle already traveling at approximately 30 kilometers per hour. Normal vehicle acceleration from a stop position would show deeper impressions in the early meters as weight shifted rearward under power. These tracks showed uniform depth from the first visible mark onward. The implications of this finding were difficult to interpret. Either the vehicle had approached the forest at speed, which should have left tracks leading up to the first visible impression, or something about the snow conditions had obscured earlier tracks, which seemed unlikely given the detailed preservation of the later portions of the trail. Attention shifted to Pierce's personal background. Thorne interviewed Pierce's family, co-workers, and friends, searching for any indication of mental state, financial problems, or personal conflicts that might explain a voluntary disappearance. The interviews painted a consistent picture of a stable individual with no apparent motive to vanish. Pierce had been planning a vacation in April, had recently renewed his professional certifications, and maintained regular contact with his parents. His bank accounts showed normal activity with no large withdrawals or transfers prior to the disappearance. Pierce's apartment in the town of Slave Lake was searched with family permission. Investigators found nothing unusual. Rent was paid through the end of March. Personal belongings were in place. Mail had accumulated in the box outside, suggesting Pierce had expected to be gone for only a short period, consistent with his work schedule. There was no note, no indication of planning an extended absence. The search for the Bronco expanded to include queries to police departments across 3 provinces. The vehicle's description, license plate number, and vehicle identification number were circulated. Scrapyards and auto parts dealers were contacted. No sightings or reports of the vehicle were received. On March 2nd, Thorne authorized a more extensive ground search of the forest surrounding the track site. 32 volunteers, including off-duty police, forestry workers and Survey Corps personnel, formed search lines and swept a grid extending 2 kilometers in all directions from the clearing where the tracks ended. The search took 3 days and covered approximately 12 square kilometers. Searchers found no trace of the Bronco, no human remains, no articles of clothing or equipment, nothing that could be connected to Rowan Pierce. During this search, One volunteer reported finding a strange object approximately 800 meters east of the clearing. The object was a metal stake driven into the ground, protruding about 15 centimeters above the snow surface. The stake was old, heavily weathered, and bore no markings or identifying features. A Survey Corps geologist examined it and stated it was consistent with boundary markers used by mining exploration teams in past decades. The presence of the stake suggested that human activity had occurred in this area at some point in the past, though there was no way to date it precisely or connect it to Pierce's disappearance. Another discovery came on March 5th, when a searcher found partial remains of what appeared to be a campsite approximately 1.4 kilometers northeast of the track terminus. The site consisted of a fire ring constructed from stones, some rusted tin cans, and fragments of weathered wood that might have been part of a temporary shelter. The materials were clearly old, possibly decades old, and forensic examination found no evidence connecting them to Pierce or to recent activity. The site was photographed and documented, but ultimately deemed irrelevant to the investigation. Thorne requested records of all radio transmissions in the region for the 24-hour period surrounding Pierce's disappearance. The communication logs showed routine traffic between survey stations, highway maintenance crews, and a few civilian CB operators. No distress calls, no anomalous transmissions, nothing that suggested Pierce had attempted to make contact. However, the logs did show a gap in recorded transmissions between 1400 and 1430 hours on February 17th. This gap occurred during the period when Pierce should have been somewhere between kilometer markers 60 and 80. The gap itself wasn't unusual. Equipment malfunctions and atmospheric conditions frequently caused brief interruptions in radio logging, but the timing was notable. One additional piece of information emerged from the radio log review. A highway maintenance operator had recorded a brief notation in his personal logbook on the afternoon of February 17th. The notation, time-stamped at approximately 1500 hours, read, "Unusual static pattern on Channel 9. High-frequency oscillation lasting approximately 90 seconds. Resolved spontaneously." Channel 9 was the frequency commonly used by Survey Corps vehicles for routine communications. The maintenance operator was interviewed, but could provide no additional details beyond what was written. He stated that the static pattern was unlike anything he'd heard before, almost musical in quality, but he hadn't considered it significant enough to report formally. By mid-March, the active search phase was scaled back. Thorne compiled a case file containing witness statements, forensic reports, photographs, maps, and timeline documentation. The file ran to 93 pages. His summary conclusion stated that Rowan Pierce had disappeared under circumstances that remained unexplained by available evidence, and that the case should remain open pending new information. The Survey Corps conducted its own internal review to determine if any equipment failures or procedural lapses had contributed to the incident. In the absence of concrete evidence, theories about Rowan Pierce's disappearance proliferated among those familiar with the case. Investigators, search participants, and members of the local community offered various explanations, each attempting to reconcile the known facts with plausible scenarios. The first and most conventional theory held that Pierce had experienced a medical emergency while driving. A heart attack, stroke, or seizure could have caused him to lose control of the vehicle, steering it off the road into the forest. This theory had the advantage of explaining sudden incapacitation, but struggled to account for several key pieces of evidence. The tire tracks showed controlled, deliberate steering, rather than the erratic path expected from a driver in medical distress. Additionally, if Pierce had suffered a medical event, the vehicle should have been found at the end of the track trail. The absence of the Bronco couldn't be explained by this scenario alone. A variation of the medical emergency theory proposed that Pierce had felt symptoms while driving, pulled off the road deliberately to rest, and then experienced a fatal event. Perhaps he'd walked away from the vehicle seeking help and collapsed in the forest where his body remained hidden beneath snow. This variation accounted for the controlled nature of the tracks, but required assuming Pierce had somehow concealed or moved the vehicle before walking away, which seemed inconsistent with someone in medical crisis. The second major theory involved mechanical failure. Perhaps the Bronco had experienced a breakdown that Pierce attempted to address by driving off the highway onto what he thought was a logging road. This theory aligned with the controlled steering pattern, but faced the same fundamental problem as the medical emergency scenario. The vehicle was gone. Even if Pierce had walked away seeking assistance and become lost in the forest, the Bronco should have been sitting in the clearing where the tracks ended. Investigator Thorne considered the possibility of theft or foul play. Perhaps Pierce had stopped to assist someone who'd flagged him down, or encountered another person in the forest who'd then attacked him and stolen the vehicle. This theory could explain both Pierce's disappearance and the missing Bronco, but it struggled with logistical problems. How had the attacker reached this remote location? Why were there no other tracks or evidence of a second party? How had the Bronco been removed from the clearing, which was surrounded by dense trees and had no vehicle access beyond the single set of tracks leading in? A more elaborate version of the foul play theory proposed that Pierce had been targeted by someone aware of his route and schedule. The attacker might have set up an ambush, forced Pierce off the road, killed him, and then concealed both body and vehicle using equipment and planning. But again, the evidence didn't support this. There were no defensive wounds or signs of struggle anywhere at the scene. The tire tracks showed no indication of evasive maneuvering or sudden braking. The scenario required assuming a level of sophistication and planning that seemed disproportionate to any potential motive. Among search participants and Survey Corps personnel, a third category of theory emerged, one that acknowledged the fundamental strangeness of the physical evidence. These theories suggested that something unusual, possibly unprecedented, had occurred. Some pointed to the documented history of previous disappearances along this same highway corridor, suggesting an environmental hazard or geographical anomaly that wasn't yet understood. Perhaps certain atmospheric conditions could disorient drivers or affect vehicle electronics in ways that led to catastrophic errors in judgment. The tracker, Joseph Crowchild, had made an observation during his examination of the site, an observation that was included in Thorne's case file, but not emphasized in official reports. Crowchild noted that the forest around the clearing was too quiet. Winter forests are normally silent, but there are small sounds, branches shifting under snow weight, occasional bird calls, the crack of expanding ice. Crowchild reported hearing none of these sounds while standing in the clearing. He described the silence as active, as though sound was being absorbed rather than simply absent. He admitted this observation was subjective and might have been influenced by the unsettling nature of the site, but he included it in his report nonetheless. Some theories ventured into territory that investigators were reluctant to document officially. These theories noted the gap in radio transmissions, the unusual static pattern reported by the maintenance operator, and the dog's reluctance to enter the clearing. They suggested that whatever happened to Pierce might have involved phenomena not easily categorized, unusual magnetic fields, atmospheric electrical events, or other environmental factors that could affect both vehicles and human physiology in ways that weren't well understood. A forestry researcher familiar with the region offered an observation about the geological composition of the area near kilometer marker 79. The bedrock in that section contained significant iron deposits and unusual mineral formations that could theoretically affect compass readings and possibly interfere with electronic systems. He suggested that if Pierce's navigation equipment had been affected, he might have become disoriented despite being familiar with the route. This theory was noted but not pursued extensively, partly because it didn't explain the disappearance of the physical vehicle. Local residents, particularly those who'd lived in the region for decades, spoke of the forest with a kind of wary respect. They mentioned hunting trips, where distances had seemed longer than maps indicated, where familiar landmarks had appeared in unexpected locations, where experienced woodsmen had briefly lost their bearings, despite clear skies and good visibility. These accounts were dismissed by most investigators as folklore, the kind of stories that accumulate in any remote region where isolation breeds caution. But a few acknowledged that such accounts, regardless of their origin, reflected a genuine psychological reality. This was a place where people felt the weight of the wilderness, where the normal rules of causation seemed less certain. One Survey Corps geologist, speaking informally rather than as part of official testimony, mentioned that several team members had experienced unusual dreams while staying at stations in the region. The dreams often involved driving through endless forest, following roads that seemed familiar but led to unexpected destinations. He emphasized that these were just dreams, likely products of the isolation and repetitive nature of survey work, but noted that multiple people had reported similar experiences without discussing them with each other beforehand. By late spring, when snow melt revealed the ground beneath, additional searches were conducted in areas that had been inaccessible during winter. These searches found nothing new. The clearing where the tracks had ended was re-examined. The ground showed no disturbance beyond what would be expected from the winter search activities. No buried objects were detected. The forest had returned to its normal state, or what passed for normal in that place. The case remained officially open, but inactive. Thorne kept the file on his desk for 6 months before finally transferring it to archive storage. Rowan Pierce was declared legally dead 7 years after his disappearance, as required by provincial statute. His family held a memorial service in Slave Lake, attended by former co-workers and friends. There was no body to bury, no definitive conclusion to mourn, only an absence that had hardened into permanent uncertainty. A green Bronco with Survey Corps markings was never recovered. Its vehicle identification number remains flagged in national databases, an automated alert that will trigger if the vehicle is ever registered, salvaged, or reported found. That alert has never been activated. Wherever the Bronco went, after leaving those tracks in the February snow of 1990, it hasn't resurfaced in any official capacity. Highway 43 continues to cut through the boreal forest between Calling Lake and the forestry zone boundary. The road has been repaved twice since Pierce's disappearance, widened slightly in some sections, marked with additional signage. The maintenance crews who work on that highway are aware of the history. Some of them avoid certain stretches after dark, not because they've seen anything unusual, but because the story has entered the local consciousness as a cautionary tale about the risks of traveling alone in winter wilderness. Survey Station 12 was decommissioned in 1998 when the Provincial Geological Survey Program was restructured. The buildings were stripped of equipment and left to deteriorate. They still stand, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, though no one maintains them now. Survey Station 9 operated until 2003 before it too was shut down. The land has returned to Crown ownership with no active use designations. The clearing where the tracks ended remains accessible, though it requires a deliberate hike through dense forest to reach it. Occasionally, someone with knowledge of the case will make the trek to see the location for themselves. They report finding nothing remarkable, just a small opening in the trees, indistinguishable from hundreds of similar clearings scattered throughout that vast boreal expanse. Detective Constable Raymond Thorne retired from the provincial police in 2007. In an interview conducted for a regional history project, he was asked about cases that had stayed with him throughout his career. He mentioned Pierce's disappearance without hesitation. He stated that the case had taught him something about the limits of investigation, about the possibility that some events might resist explanation, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the framework for understanding that evidence is incomplete. He also mentioned that he'd driven Highway 43 only once since the investigation ended, and had felt uncomfortable for the entire length of the journey, though he couldn't articulate why. The tracker Joseph Crowchild passed away in 2011. Among his personal effects was a journal containing field notes from dozens of search operations he'd participated in over 3 decades. The entry regarding Pierce's case was unusually long, several pages of observations and reflections. The final paragraph read, "Some places hold their secrets more tightly than others. The forest where the tracks ended is one such place. I don't believe we're meant to understand what happened there. The land has its own logic, older than ours, and sometimes that logic intersects with human affairs in ways we can't reconcile." Rowan Pierce walked into that intersection. Whether he walked out on the other side into some geography we don't have maps for is a question that can't be answered with the tools we brought to the search. The case file, designated NW90217, sits in the Provincial Archive Storage Facility, approximately 80 kilometers from where Pierce was last seen. The facility is climate-controlled, designed to preserve documents for decades or centuries. The manila folder containing 17 pages of reports, photographs and testimony is stored in Section K, Row 14, Box 307. It waits there with thousands of other files, most of them concerning mundane administrative matters, a few concerning mysteries that remain unsolved. In the years since Pierce's disappearance, 3 additional people have gone missing along northern highway corridors in Alberta. None of these cases share the specific details of Pierce's incident, but all share the common element of vehicles that were either never found or discovered in locations that raised more questions than they answered. No formal pattern analysis has been conducted to connect these cases. They remain separate files in separate archives, investigated by different personnel in different jurisdictions at different times. The Survey Corps, now operating under a different name as part of a federal geological program, maintains a brief internal document about safety protocols for field personnel. The document includes a section titled Historical Incidents Requiring Protocol Updates. Uday, Pierce's case is listed there in 3 sentences. February 1990, surveyor failed to arrive at destination station. Vehicle and operator never recovered. Led to implementation of mandatory interval radio check-ins for solo travel in remote areas. The reduction of a human disappearance to procedural abstraction, necessary for institutional memory but insufficient for those who knew Pierce personally. His parents kept his apartment furnishings for a decade before finally donating them to charity. They moved to British Columbia in 2001, seeking a different landscape, a different association with distance and wilderness. They never received answers about what happened to their son, never found a location where they could stand and say with certainty, "This is where it ended."